This time I'm going to be talking about multitask and multilingual learning. We've talked about multitask learning already a little bit in the context of pre-training, and because we covered it pretty extensively there, I'm going to go through that part a little bit quickly and then move on to multilingual learning. And this time, I will be presenting the first half, and Aditi, one of our wonderful TAs who knows a lot about multilingual learning, will be presenting the second half. So um, uh, hope you enjoy that. Okay, so without further ado, um, the first thing, or the reason why multitask learning is so effective with respect to neural nets, and multitask learning actually um, uh, wasn't proposed for neural nets in particular. It's a general purpose uh, um, method that can be used for lots of things, but it's particularly useful uh, for neural nets. And the reason why is because neural nets are essentially feature extractors, and multitask learning is a good way to extract features that work across multiple different tasks. Actually, the first work on multitask learning was by Caruana, Rich Caruana, who did it while he was here doing his PhD at Carnegie Mellon, working with Tom Mitchell and Herb Simons. So that was, as far as I know, that was not done specifically in the context of neural networks, but we'll be talking about neural networks here for obvious reasons. So neural nets are feature extractors, and they create a vector representation of sentences or words for use in downstream tasks, as we've talked about a lot so far. And in many cases, the same representations can be used in multiple tasks. And we've thought of many different disparate examples with respect to this. And there are different types of learning that I talked about when we talked about pre-training. And just as a quick refresher, multitask learning is a general term for training on multiple tasks. Transfer learning is a type of multitask learning where we only really care about one of the tasks that we're going to be learning for. And domain adaptation is a special type of transfer learning where the output space is the same, but we want to handle different topics or genres. So for example, sentiment analysis across different types of genres. So to go into methods for multitask learning, standard multitask learning is basically training representations to do well on multiple tasks at once. So for example, we could have, this is an example, we'll run it through an encoder and we'll get these kind of general purpose representations. But at the same time, we could use these translations for different tasks. So for example, translation or tagging or whatever. There's a bunch of different ways to do this. In general, it's a simple, one very simple way to do this is to randomly choose a mini batch from one of multiple tasks, and to do this throughout the training process. And there are many, many examples of this. In fact, one of the first papers that really modernized neural networks for NLP, natural language processing from scratch by Colabert and Weston, the whole point of the paper essentially was that multitask learning is a very powerful, or maybe not the whole point, but a very important point of the paper was multitask learning is a very powerful method for training neural networks effectively, and they had language modeling objectives and then the downstream classification or tagging objectives, much like we do nowadays as well. So one thing to be careful about in multitask learning is that multitask learning essentially, we have these two tasks, and these two tasks might not be equally simple to learn or might not have equal amounts of data. So a very powerful method for this, which we've already covered, is pre-training, where we first train on one task that has a lot of data and then train on another. So an example, this is an example. So we have an encoder, we train it on a translation task or a language modeling task where we can get lots of data. And then we use this to initialize the encoder for another task like tagging. And it's widely used in word embeddings and pre-training sentence representations or contextualized word representations, etc. So we've already talked about pre-training, and when I talked about pre-training before, we mainly focused on models, uh, or I guess we focused on several different aspects of pre-training. One was the model, another was the pre-training objective, and another was what data you're using, and we kind of separated off BERT and XLNet and Roberta, Electra, all of the labeled techniques based on these different aspects of them. There's also a lot of other things that we need to think about uh, for training our models as well. So one thing that I don't actually have yeah, sorry, I'll cover that later. So a first thing that we can think about is when we are doing pre-training, um, one of the problems with pre-training is that we have a large data set, and we want to adapt to a new task where we have a very small data set, right? Um, so the problem with this is if we have a small data set, it may become very easy to overfit to this small data set. And in order to avoid doing this, one way to do this is to do, sorry. One way to do this is to add regularization. And so we need some sort of regularization to prevent this moving away from the values. And the most common way to do this is through early stopping. So this is also, largely what we use in BERT, or whatever other, kind of pre-training and fine-tuning paradigm we have. We have early stopping, which gives us implicit regularization, where we stop when the model starts to overfit to the task that we care about. And in addition, this can be combined with, picking a good learning rate and other things like this. This is okay. However, it's a very indirect way of regularizing our model to prevent it from overfitting too much to the new task. Another more explicit way to do this is to have some sort of L2 regularization, where we have L2 regularization, or any sort of explicit regularization, such as L2, where we can do the difference from the initial parameters. And so a good thing about this is this explicitly pushes you back towards the original parameters. The bad thing about this is that you need to keep a copy of the parameters around so you can calculate this difference in the first place. So you keep the original parameters and the modified parameters around. And this can be computationally or memory or costly in memory space. Then finally, you can also do dropout. So dropout is a type of implicit regularization that prevents you from, learning the model too strongly. And this paper by Barone et al., which was specifically for machine translation, compares all of these different methods together. And they find that actually adding large amounts of dropout, or a much higher amount of dropout, is almost as good, or sometimes even better, than explicit regularization. And it is much easier to implement. You just need to turn up the dropout rate on your models. So I think if you're interested in these, pre-training fine-tuning things, this would be a good paper to look at. There might also be other good references as well. So another method that people have used for this pre-training in fine-tuning paradigm Okay, so I got a question. Briefly give some insights about early stopping. I've often noticed the model gets better at 5 to 10 epochs of increasing validation loss. Is there some intuition towards deciding the number of epochs to wait, or are they largely just experimentation? So yeah, that's a very good question. Um, so I actually believe that I talked about the relationship between early stopping and accuracy in an earlier class. I think it might have been one of the very early classes on debugging neural networks or something like that. So if you'd like, you can go back and take a look. But the long story short, accuracy will very often continue to go up for a while after the development loss starts getting worse. And the reason why this is because the model is getting more and more confident. And as the model gets more and more confident, the perplexity or the cross entropy might get worse, but the predictions will continue to, or the prediction accuracy will continue to get better. So I think I talk about that in the video more, so I'll refer you back to that. Is there any intuition towards deciding the number of epochs to wait, or is it largely just experimentation? So that's a good question, and I think the answer is this is basically a hyperparameter. And the reason why it's a hyperparameter is it depends on so many things. It depends on the size of your training data set. It depends on the similarity between the training set and dev set. Are they from exactly the same distribution or different distributions, etc. So I think it's basically impossible to say, but fortunately you always have a dev set, and you can just wait until the dev loss peaks. So the second question is, how is MTL different from continuous learning or maybe continual learning? And from the understanding, the regularization technique is commonly used in continual learning. So that's a very good point. I can talk about that. So continual learning, one of the students I work with, Paul, has a nice paper on continual learning. So I'll bring that up, and so show some figures from there. Hang on one second. So this is the paper, Regularizing Trajectories to Mitigate Catastrophic Forgetting. And the basic problem, what the continual learning problem is it's essentially that when you move from one task to another, you tend to forget information that was previously memorized by the neural network. So here is an example, which is when you train on a particular task for a while, you will very quickly peak on the accuracy. Sorry, everyone can see my screen here, right, with the paper? Okay, great. So you very quickly peak on the accuracy and achieve a certain level of accuracy for a particular task. And then as you continue training the model on a different task for a while, you'll gradually forget the information that you had previously on the neural network. And this phenomenon is called catastrophic forgetting in the continual learning literature. And so the idea of continual learning is you would like to continue training the neural network to do better on new tasks, but not get worse on the old tasks. So in other words, don't forget the skills that you already know while being able to acquire new skills. And that's obviously, very important for humans because everybody in this class is acquiring new skills with respect to neural networks for natural language processing. But you don't want to forget how to like eat dinner or something like that, right? So so basically, continual learning, a lot of the things that they measure are, or a lot of the things that they consider are ways to regularize the neural network so that it doesn't forget the old tasks. And some common ways to do so are things like elastic weight consolidation, which is essentially, it's basically just regularization. It's a type of regularization. And also episodic replay or episodic memory, which is where you just continue training on previous data from previous tasks. So long story short, I guess continual learning is essentially a type of multitask learning that's framed in a particular way. Does that answer the question? Okay, cool. So yeah, let me go back. So another technique that we can use in multitask learning is selective parameter adaptation. So selective parameter adaptation, basically, sometimes it's better to adapt only some of the parameters or to adapt parameters only a little at a time. There's several examples of doing this. To give one example, in cross-lingual transfer learning for neural machine translation, Zoff et al. Examined the best parameters to adapt. And basically they find that instead of adapting the entire model by training it on one language and adapting it to another language, it's better to adapt only a subset of the parameters. So retraining the source embeddings is a good idea. Retraining the source side RNN is a good idea. Target RNN is a good idea. Target attention is a good idea. But retraining the target input and output embeddings actually lowers the BLEU score. So basically the idea is you want to retrain everything except the lexical information on the target side, where the target side, in this case, the target side is English. Of course, this is just an example. This isn't a general, like claim that works everywhere, but it's one example. Some other examples are when you're adapting a pre-trained language model to to a new task. Sometimes you won't want to adapt every parameter at the same time, but rather adapt like one layer first, and then adapt a second layer, then adapt a third layer, then adapt a fourth layer, etc. So if you look around in the literature, you should be able to find examples like this, and I can give more pointers if people are interested. So another thing, this is a little bit less widely used, but I think it's a nice, is there an intuition to find what should be adapted? So that's another good question. Basically, this is somewhat task specific, right? So it's essentially the things that you would expect to not be learned well yet, the things that you would expect to not be learned well yet, given your pre-training task, but would be learned better after adaptation. So you kind of need to think about the problem a little bit, but in this case, this is, to give a more concrete example here, this is a French-English translation system being adapted to, I believe, Uzbek English or Uyghur English. So you have this very large parameter, very large data setting for French English and very small data setting um, for Uzbek English. And so because of this, on the target side, you would expect like the English side to be trained well, but you wouldn't expect the source side to be trained well at all. And also, you might want um, uh, you might want the parts that consider the interaction between the two languages to be adapted. So because of this, like I can kind of explain why in this particular setting, um, you know, this particular variety of adaptation is good. I don't know if there's a general rule that would allow you to decide which parts of the parameters should be adapted well. I imagine you could learn it, for example, using meta-learning techniques or something like this, but I don't know if there's a really obvious general purpose answer. Or maybe the general purpose answer is, yeah, I don't know if there is a good general purpose answer. Yeah. Okay. So soft parameter tying, it's also possible to share parameters loosely between various tasks where parameters are regularized to be closer but not tied in a hard fashion. So to give an example, again, this is an example for multilingual learning. I feel like multilingual learning is a very easy to explain example because you're kind of doing the same task, but the underlying structure of the language is hard to, you know, is very different. But in this particular case, what they did was they had different sets of parameters for each of the languages, but they regularized the parameters to be closer together. So like you might have the softmax layer being similar, the hidden layer being similar between them, but they're not, they don't have to be exactly the same. So this is a kind of older work that I think nonetheless is relatively interesting. So in this particular work, they had different layers for different tasks, and the underlying motivation for this is that there are certain tasks in natural language processing or natural language understanding that should be easier to learn than others. So for example, part of speech tagging, we think this would be relatively easy because it requires only very local context in most cases anyway. Chunking, so basically splitting phrases into chunks is still a tagging problem, but it's a little bit harder because the information is less local. And then you have dependency parsing, which is a little bit higher level. You have relatedness or you know, sentence relatedness or textual entailment, et cetera, which are on an even higher level. So basically what they did was they created a model that explicitly does each of these different tasks at different layers of the network. The interesting thing about this is this paper explicitly encodes this intuition, which turns out to be a pretty good intuition. Another thing, another paper which, sorry, I actually didn't add to the slides, but I realize now I probably should have, is this paper, which is very nice. It's Bert rediscovers the classical NLP pipeline. And basically what they show is they tried to do different levels of NLP tasks by using the representations of different layers of BERT. And they essentially measure which layer does the best for each of the tasks. And as you gradually move through like kind of the complexity levels of the tasks, you can see that the layer invert that gives you the best accuracy also tends to be like a deeper layer. So interestingly, before we were doing this large scale like pre-training of models that automatically discovered a lot of information about NLP tasks. This paper had the intuition that you should be doing it on like with the more complicated tasks and deeper layers. So I definitely recommend taking a look at this paper as well, and like give you things to think about better model architectures or better ways to use the pre-trained models we have. So we had a question: is there any comparison on how multilingual learning would compare with a new language simply learned by domain adaptation? So that's a good question. So multilingual learning versus learning a new language by domain adaptation. I, there definitely are several papers on this. I'm going to introduce one of my papers because it's one of the topics that I'm familiar with, and I think Aditi will also be talking about this a little bit about various multilingual learning methods later. But there definitely are these. But this paper by me and Junjie examines this relatively closely. So we have a figure in the paper here where we test, where we compare on a translation task, single language learning, bilingual learning, multilingual learning, and then each of these models then adapted to learning on a particular language. So I think this table might be exactly the type of thing that you're looking for. Okay. So another thing to think about is there's multitask learning, and in addition to this, even if it's the same task, there can be slightly different annotation standards. So to give some examples, for semantic tagging or semantic parsing, there are different standards for how you could annotate relations within a particular sentence. And this is an example of how there are these slightly different annotations. And one way you can do things is you can do multitask learning over these different annotations. You can also kind of model your soft parameter sharing so that it more explicitly links together with the similarities or differences between the annotation standards. There's also a really interesting paper, this is not from NLP, but it is, it's interesting, so I'd like to introduce it nonetheless, which is if you have different people who annotated the data, and it's a hard task where annotators might not get 100% accuracy, you can actually train a model that models in each of the individual annotators. And in this particular case, in this paper, it was a medical image classification task where they actually had 5 different doctors, or I don't remember if it was 5, but some number of different doctors annotate different images. They learned a model for each of the doctors. So they learned, an image classifier that tried to model similar behavior to the doctors who were doing the annotation. And then at the very end, they used an ensemble of all of those different models. So it was essentially like trying to model each of the doctors, how they would make a decision, then have the doctors vote on the final choice. And that proved to be effective. I think it's a creative and interesting yet conceptually simple approach. Okay, so in terms of kind of high level overview of multitask learning, that's one thing. Are there any questions here? Guess I'm not getting any, so I'll continue on. So with respect to domain adaptation, the reason why I cover domain adaptation separately is because from a practical point of view, it's super, super important in NLP systems, because if we build a system on one domain, it will invariably not work as well on new domains. And so we have basically one task, but the incoming data could be from very different distributions. So we could have news text, medical text, spoken language, etc. And very often we'll have a big grab bag of all domains, and we want to tailor to a specific domain. We have two settings. One setting is unsupervised and another is supervised. So in supervised domain adaptation, we have both inputs and outputs in the target domain. In unsupervised, we have just inputs in the target domain. Or just outputs, depending if it's something like a sequence modeling task, we might have just outputs as well. So for supervised adaptation, we have data in the target domain. And so one very, very simple way is through the pre-training and fine-tuning paradigm. So we do simple pre-training on all of the data, and then we do fine-tuning to tailor to domain-specific data. In unsupervised adaptation, we have no, input-output pairs in the target domain. So basically, one way we can do this is by matching distributions of the features. So to give a few very simple examples for how we can do supervised domain adaptation, one way we can do this is to train general domain and domain-specific feature extractors, and then sum their results together. So basically, you have one kind of general domain encoder, you have a specific domain encoder, and then you sum them together. So this is kind of like the general domain decoder. You have the general domain encoder, and then you have something that's a little bit like a residual connection that tries to learn the domain residual, which would be the change in the features based on the fact that this is from a particular domain. A much easier way to do things is to simply append a domain tag to the input. So, if this is a, like from the sports domain, you would add sports to the beginning of the input. And this is, very practical and relatively easy to do, yet nonetheless works well. Oh yeah, so here's the example. So we have the news token to the news text, and we have the medical token to the medical text. So for unsupervised adaptation, there's also a large number of methods that you can do here. So we can do feature matching. So one thing that we can do is we can either adapt the whole network or the latter layers of the network to match labeled and unlabeled data using any sort of domain kind of like distribution matching technique. So in this early paper, they used multi-kernel mean maximum discrepancy as their domain matching method. But recently, almost everybody uses adversarial networks to do this because adversarial networks are extremely easy to train and easy conceptually. So I think I talked about this a little bit in the adversarial class as well. Okay, and that was a very, very brief overview of domain adaptation things. And if there are no questions, I guess I can turn it over to Aditi, who will do the multilingual learning techniques. Aditi, can you talk real quick?
Yeah. Can everyone hear me?
I can.
Okay, so I guess
okay. So I'll mute and turn it over. Oh, I need to allow you to share screen also.
Right.
So if you could share.
Mm. Okay, so hopefully everybody can see my screen, and feel free to let me know if I'm going too fast or if you have any questions. Okay, so in multilingual learning, we would like to learn models that process multiple languages because we want NLP systems to work equally well for all languages apart from English. So why do we need a multilingual learning system? So there are two main reasons. The first being that languages are often related to each other and hence can benefit from each other. So we have transfer learning where we can improve the accuracy on the lower resource language by transferring knowledge from higher resource languages. The second reason why multilingual learning is advantageous is from memory savings point of view. So we can use a single model for all languages versus we have to train one language for each, one model for each language, which can get computationally expensive. So here is a high-level flow chart showing the different techniques that we can use depending on how much data we have in the target language. So let's take the first path where let's say we have sufficiently labeled data in the target language. Then we ask the question whether we want a model which must serve many languages, but it has strict memory constraints. If that is the case, then it would be best to train a single model, a single multilingual model for all the languages. But if we don't have strict memory constraints, then we can use a cross-lingual supervised adaptation technique where essentially for a given target language, we can train on a single high resource language or a group of related languages. But if we don't have sufficiently labeled data in the target language, and if we have access to annotators who are native speakers of that language, then we can use machine learning techniques like active learning, which allows us to collect data in the target language efficiently. But if we don't have access to annotators, then we can do a zero-shot adaptation method, where essentially we can directly apply the multilingual model or the cross-lingual model on the target data. So here we see an example of a multilingual neural machine translation model where we have a single model and we want to translate into several languages. So one simple way that people have done is by adding a language identification tag as shown here for the example. So here for an English to French example, we have added the French identification tag in front of the example. Similarly, for an English to Japanese example, we add the Japanese identification tag. This is very similar to what we just saw a few slides back for domain adaptation. So one advantage of appending language identification tags is that we can also use this model for zero-shot learning. So how it works is that we can train one model for French to English, another model for Japanese to English, and in this process, the language identification tags also get trained, and we can directly use these embeddings to train from French to Japanese. So this works, but of course it's not as effective as translating from French to English to Japanese. And one reason is that there is a lot of parallel data available from and to English. So that is one reason why French to English to Japanese might work better than doing this transitive relation. We have seen that language model pre-training is very effective for many NLP tasks. One prominent example being that of BERT. So just to recap, BERT uses two objective functions for training. One, the first is the masked language model, wherein basically randomly tokens are masked and the model has to predict the masked tokens. The second objective function which BERT uses is the next sentence prediction, wherein two consecutive sentences are fed, and the model has to predict the next sentence given the current sentence. Many recent work have come up which extend this BERT objective for multilingual pre-training, such as multilingual BERT, XLM, XLMR. So here I have a summarized version of all of these models. So multilingual BERT, or referred as MBERT, and XLM are both unsupervised models, where basically they are jointly trained over the concatenated monolingual corpus of all the languages. MBERT uses the same training objective function as the original BERT model, which is the MLM and the NSP. XLM uses a modified masked language model objective function, wherein the difference is that instead of using the word piece vocabulary which BERT uses, XLM uses a byte pair encoding. And they find that using byte pair encoding, it leads to an increase in the shared vocabulary across all the languages, and which is one reason why XLM performs better than MBERT on many of the multilingual tasks. There is another variant of XLM called as XLM TLM. It's basically a supervised model which uses this modified MLM objective over parallel sentences. So essentially, one training example consists of the same text in two languages. And similar to BERT, you just mask out randomly some tokens from each language. And the model now has also access to can also use the context in the second language to predict the mask tokens in the first language. So having this kind of supervision allows the model to learn better multilingual representations. And even empirically, they find that the XLM TLM variant performs better than MBERT and XLM on the multilingual tasks. All right. So despite several advantages of the multilingual learning pre-training methods, there are several several papers which have shown the difficulties also associated with multilingual training. One being the trade-off between the model capacity and the number of languages used during training. So for a fixed size model, the per language capacity decreases as we increase the number of languages. So if you look at the chart on the right, on the x-axis, we have the number of languages used for training, and on the y-axis, we have the accuracy on the XNLI task. So if you look at the gray bar chart, which is the accuracy for all the languages, so as you increase the number of languages, the accuracy peaks up to a point after which the performance degrades. So the one hypothesis is that as you increase the number of languages, there is a capacity dilution. So inherently, the model assigns some parameters to each of the languages. And if you increase the number of languages, the model tends to learn more generalized language representations and moves away from language-specific representations. And similar observations have been made by Aroni and all, where they see that for machine translation, if you increase the number of low-resource languages, there is a decrease in the quality of high-resource language translations. So since for multilingual models, there's a wide variety of languages we use for training, most models use a temperature-based strategy to control the ratio of samples from different languages. So for each language, you basically sample a sentence with probability P raised to power 1 by T, where T is a temperature constant and P is the proportion of the language-specific corpus with respect to all the data set. So if T is equal to 1, it essentially means that you are just doing a naive sampling from the original data distribution, where you tend to get more samples from the high resource languages, but it will starve off the low resource languages. But if you look at the other extreme, where T is, let's say, 100, then it's going to approximately sample equal number of data points for each language. Most models have used T equal to 5, which is an optimal number and is a hyperparameter here. So we looked at multilingual models where we had trained one model over all the languages. Now here we'll talk about cross-lingual transfer learning, which essentially leverages resources or data from one or more high resource languages to benefit the low resource languages. Some popular techniques of cross-lingual transfer learning, which we'll discuss here, are data augmentation and annotation projection. So data augmentation is simply that you train a model on the combined data sets, similar to what we did in the multilingual learning. In that, we categorize it into two parts. We have the single source transfer, where you transfer from a single high resource language, or you have the multi-source transfer setting, where you transfer from a group of related languages. And similarly, you have a data balancing strategy, which balances the ratio of samples, and then you apply it to the task model. And the next question then comes to mind is, how do we select which languages to transfer from for a given language? So most people use a simple heuristic where they try to use the high resource languages from the same language family, but often it's not very simple. There's a recent paper by Lin and al., which provide a method to select a language to transfer from for a given language. And they do so based on certain parameters like the available training data in all of these languages, how similar they are based on typology, maybe orthography, phonology. And based on all of these features, they give a ranking of the list of languages which are best to transfer from. Then between single source and multi-source transfer, Cottrell and Hegel have found that multi-source transfer performs much better than single source for morphological tagging. And it intuitively also makes sense because languages are related to multiple languages, could be related to multiple languages along different dimensions. Like one language could be similar to the other language based on orthography. It could also be similar to a third language based on typology. So in such cases, using a multi-source transfer is probably a better option. But what happens if the languages don't share the same script? So most of the transfer learning methods rely on orthography overlap, and in that case, like lexical overlap. And in those cases, transfer learning wouldn't work properly. So a common solution is that we use phonological representations to make the similarity between the languages apparent. So for instance, Rijwani and all have used a pivot-based entity linking system for low resource languages. So if you see the figure, there's a grapheme-based pivoting where Marathi is the low resource language and Hindi is the pivoting language used to learn from English. So Marathi and Hindi have the same script, but they don't share it with English. So using grapheme-based, like grapheme here refers to the orthography. So using grapheme-based pivoting, you can see that it's not easy to learn from English. But if you convert all of this orthography into its phonemic representations, which is approximated by the International Phonetic Alphabet here, you can see that immediately the similarity between the languages becomes very apparent. So phonological representations are provide a nice way to leverage lexical overlap when languages don't share the same script. Another method for transfer learning here is annotation projection, wherein basically you induce annotations in the target language using parallel data or bilingual dictionary. So if you see here, you have an English sentence with part of speech annotations, and you have its French translation. So using the part of speech tags from English, you can project these annotations onto the French data using either some sort of bilingual dictionary or parallel data. And you can induce annotations in the target language, and then you can just train a model on these induced annotations. Such annotation projection methods have been very commonly also used for a zero-shot transfer setting. So she and all basically project annotations from high resource NER data into a low resource target language. And how they do is that you have monolingual representations of two languages. So here, the red dots show the monolingual representations for Spanish, and blue dots are the monolingual word representations for English. So the authors first project these monolingual embeddings into a shared space so that similar words are now clustered together. And for every, so you have the English label NER dataset. For every label token in English, you find its nearest neighbor in this common space, and you find its nearest neighbor in the Spanish. So you find the Spanish word which is closest to this English word, and you simply copy the label for that English token. So in this way, you can generate, you can induce annotations on a new language, and you can simply train your NER model on the target language using these induced annotations. And their empirical results show that it's really effective, especially for languages which are very closely related, like English and Spanish, because their word order is the same, and they also share a lot of vocabulary. Another model which proposed by Chen and al., they basically leverage language adversarial networks to learn both language invariant and language specific features. So on the left, you have the model architecture, where you have two components. The first is the shared feature extractor FS. So basically, you have the shared feature extractor is forced to learn language invariant representations by training an adversarial network, where you have the language discriminator D, which is so FS is trying to fool the discriminator D in finding out what language the sentence comes from. And by forcing FS to do that, you invariantly learn language invariant features. The second component, which is the private feature extractor, it is forced to learn language specific features. So on the right, you have the private feature extractor. You have an expert representation for each language. So you have three modules for English, Spanish, and Chinese. And then for a given sentence, you have an expert gate, which basically computes a convex combination of all of these experts. So for a given target language, say German, the trained expert gate will find the optimal weights for each of these experts. So for German, since it's most similar to English, it will maybe assign your alpha 1 will probably be 0.7, which means that German is probably learning more from the English expert as compared to the Chinese expert. So this model basically tries to combine both language invariant and language specific features in the same architecture. And the advantage of this model is that they don't require any bilingual dictionary or any parallel data. They simply work with monolingual representations to compute the multilingual word representations. Another way to create in-language training data is through active learning. So active learning is a family of methods which basically aims to select useful or informative data for human annotation such that it maximizes the end model performance. So here we have proposed a recipe which combines both transfer learning and active learning for low resource NER. So how it works is that you have the English label data set, so we have the English NER data. Using any cross-lingual transfer learning method, like in this case, we had used annotation projection, you project the annotations from English onto the target language, and you get some initial annotations. Then you train NER model on this induced annotations. And on top of this train NER model, you use a span-based active learning method, which basically selects subspans within a sentence for annotation. So if you see here, the highlighted span in orange is the span selected for annotation, and they are then presented to the annotator to annotate. Once the user annotates them, they are put back into the label pool, and then this cycle essentially continues until you have either exhausted all of the tokens or you have achieved a certain level of accuracy. So here, by combining both transfer learning and active learning, we're trying to utilize high resource trying to utilize knowledge from high resource languages, as well as get good quality data in the target language itself. So I guess that's all we had.
Okay. So yeah, I guess we're a little bit earlier than normal, but we'd be happy to take any questions. Multilingual learning is something obviously that I'm very familiar with, and Aditi is also very familiar with. So be happy to take involved questions. I'd also like to point out that we'll have a multilingual learning class next semester in the fall. So if you're interested in learning more, then you can feel free to take that as well. But anything that people want to ask? So if we have unrelated languages like English, Hungarian, and English Japanese, then is multilingual modeling effective? So I'll let Aditi try to answer that first, and then I can go in and give some more.
Right. So if we have in unrelated languages like English, Hungarian, so one thing is that if having in general more data helps, like English, Hungarian, and English, Japanese is going to have a lot of data. So one thing I have a question, like, would you want this model to train for Hungarian to Japanese? Like, is this in context to machine translation? The question? No, we just want the.
So basically, I think the answer is, or the question is, like, if you want a model that goes into English, Hungarian, and all you have is English, Japanese data, would it be useful to train the English, Japanese system, or should you just not bother and use English, Hungarian, and actually, and just use English, Hungarian data, like all the data that you have. Actually, Aditi, if you don't mind stopping sharing your screen for a second, I can. That examines this. It's called Choosing Transfer Languages for Cross-lingual Learning. And the basic idea is there's a lot of things that could go into deciding whether a language would be useful to transfer from. And so we considered a lot of different factors in this language, in this paper. One is like how much data do you have in the language that you're transferring from? Another thing is how similar are the languages? So how close together are they on the planet Earth, which kind of is a proxy for relatedness. And other things for like genetic distance or something like this. So we actually did a whole bunch of experiments, which are included in this repository here. And if you look at the data, this is the raw data that went into training our model, and we have results for machine translation, et cetera. And the answer is here, the language on the rows, in the rows is the extra language. The language in the columns is the language that we're actually processing. And the answer is, if you have sufficient data in the language that you're interested in, it's probably better. It's probably better to train them, or you won't get very much of a gain by transferring from another language. If you don't have sufficient data in the language you're transferring from, you can get a gain even if the languages are quite different. So, for example, here the language that we're trying to improve our accuracy on is Azerbaijani, but we can use Arabic data to like improve this. And Arabic is not so similar to Azerbaijani. We can use German data to improve the accuracy. So If you're interested, I think this paper is actually a pretty interesting paper on that topic. So you can take a look, and we have the data to actually back up that answer. So let's see. Yeah, so like just to summarize, I guess the answer is if you have sufficient data in the very different languages, then it probably won't help very much. And of course, it definitely. Oh, so one other thing is if the languages are more similar, it definitely does help. So to give an example here, if you go down to the bottom of this sheet, I've ranked the top 3 languages for each of the top 3 transfer languages for each of them, each of the target languages. And Azerbaijani is a language that's very similar to Turkish, and Turkish does indeed give you the best accuracy. Belarusian is very similar to Ukrainian and Russian, and Ukrainian and Russian do indeed give the best accuracy. So language similarity is definitely a thing that helps here. But it's not absolutely necessary to improve accuracy. Then the second question, we're currently working on a multilingual QA system for the final project. MBERT was used as a baseline model. Any suggestions on how to improve on this baseline? So that's a very good question. I guess it depends a lot on the specific situation that you're working with. Do you have any annotated data in the target language? Can you get annotators for the target language? Or are you assuming zero-shot transfer, et cetera? And I think basically the flowchart that Aditi showed earlier in this probably gives you a good idea. If you're, if you have memory constraints, then you'll want to be just training one big model. Otherwise, you could be adapting to the new method and to the new language, and you could be using adaptation techniques, or if you have no data in the new language, you'll have to do zero-shot adaptation. So I guess my general advice is look at the flowchart that Aditi showed you, find the type of technique that you're interested in, and follow some of the references that we cited in this presentation. And then if you're still not sure what to do, then definitely talk to the TAs, and a lot of the TAs have experience with multilingual modeling, especially Aditi, but also some others as well. So, or me, obviously, you can always come to my office hours. And my Zoom office hours are not very popular, so I have lots of time sitting around with nobody showing up to my Zoom office hours. So feel free to drop in if you're interested. Any other questions? These are good questions.